Thanks for joining. If you have been looking at the news recently, you've been hearing about the fact that there is now some sort of pills that are available that will provide the same benefits that we get from exercise. And so the question is, do we really have pills that will mimic exercise, that will provide the same benefits that we get from exercise, that will lead to things like weight loss? And we've been searching for this kind of pill for the last couple decades. And so the question that we have to keep asking is it just hype or is there something really there? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
And so we look at exercise mimics. What we're really looking at is we're looking at some sort of medicine, some sort of chemical that we can give the body that's going to provide the same metabolites, the same chemicals into our body that we get being moved around the body following exercise. And we look at these based off of a few classes of chemicals that we reference as exercise mimics or exercise mimetics. And we'll look at specifically two distinct types of classes here. The one that's been in the news most recently is the estrogen receptor agonists or the estrogen receptor activators. And the estrogen receptor activators is going to function on the estrogen receptors within our cells that will stimulate the same responses that we see from estrogen in circulation. The next type of mimic that we will see is what's referred as a PPAR activator. And the PPAR activator is going to activate certain types of enzymes, certain types of genes within the cells that will stimulate the use of lipids within the cells that leads to breakdown of fatty acids, breakdown of lipids for use along various types of pathways. Another type of agonist or activator is the AMPK agonist, which is going to function on the AMPK pathway, which is one of the pathways in the energy pathways that we use within our body that will look at and change how we go about doing the energy molecules that we need in our body to do the work that we need, but will also function on the pathways associated with feeding and whether or not you feel full or whether or not you feel hungry. One that was in the news a lot in 2023 was the GLP-1 medicines, the Ozempic to be one of the name brands that's out there. And the GLP-1 agonists are going to function on the GLP-1 pathways, which is typically looked at in terms of a diabetic medical pathway in terms of treatment for diabetes, along with other types of treatments. And the GLP-1 agonist is going to function on the GLP-1 pathway, which is going to change the way in which we have glucose metabolism, have insulin sensitivity, and a host of other metabolic pathways. We'll be looking specifically at the ERR activators and the GLP-1 agonists here. The other pathway that we look at in terms of exercise mimics regulating is on the anorexic or orexic regulation. The anorexic and orexic regulation is looking at, do we feel hungry or do we feel full? One of the things that we talk about in terms of exercise and why a lot of people say, oh, I don't like to exercise, is that when I exercise, I feel more hungry, put quotes around that. And they're exercising in order to lose weight, but they feel that it's kind of counterbalancing because when I get done exercising, I feel hungry. And part of this is that orexic, anorexic regulation that comes into play. And so we start looking at this anorexic and orexic regulators. What we're really looking at is how we can go about regulating a couple of key hormones, a couple of key neurotransmitters within the brain and within circulation coming away from the gastrointestinal system as well as from the skeletal muscles. That's going to trigger, do I want to eat or am I okay in terms of how much food I have and how much fuel I have available to my body? And so, like I said, one of the ones that we'll be looking at here is the ERR agonist. And one of the ones that's been in news recently is this drug in development known as SLU-PP332. And what it is, it's a chemical that looks like estrogen and activates the estrogen receptor. And when it activates the estrogen receptor, it's going to trigger a couple of key genes in the estrogen pathways. And in skeletal muscle and in a couple of other tissues, what's going to do is it's going to activate mitochondrial actions. And by activating mitochondrial actions, it's going to increase aerobic metabolism. And by increasing aerobic metabolism, it's going to lead to the same types of things that we see in terms of endurance responses from exercise. But that's just one of the pathways that we look at when we look at the estrogen receptors. There are other pathways that we look at with estrogen receptors in terms of functions within the brain, where we look at estrogen receptors and activations of the neurons leading to increased neural connections, what we refer to as synaptogenesis, which is going to be important in terms of learning and memory. But it's also going to lead to changes in insulin sensitivity, both in peripheral tissues, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, liver, as well as in the brain, which helps with inflammatory responses. We see within adipose tissue a change of fatty acid utilization. We see a change in level of insulin sensitivity, a change in thermogenesis, that is the production of heat coming away from the cells based off of energy metabolism. A lot of benefits come about from activations of the estrogen receptors. However, by utilizing the estrogen mimics, the ERR agonists, we have to worry about, we have chemicals that are going to function on or act like estrogen within the body, which can cause issues, particularly when we start looking at estrogen sensitivity and the chance for cancer proliferation from the estrogen drugs or the estrogen mimics. The other thing we have to look at is these estrogen drugs acting like an endocrine disrupting chemical in terms of an estrogen-like substance in the body. We start looking at these ERR agonists in terms of the assumption as it relates to disease prevention. It's predominantly looking at how exercise can lead to increased endurance activity and potential weight loss based off of a few assumptions. The assumption first is that exercise benefits coming away due to energy balance issues. The other assumption is that a lot of the disease issues come about because of mitochondrial dysfunction, and we're able to have appropriate mitochondrial functioning taking place because of the drug. The increased lipid utilization as fuel in order to provide the energy necessary for the cells, so the cells are able to do the work that we need to do. The fourth assumption, and this is one of the big assumptions we'll get to later on in this discussion, is that overweight automatically means metabolic issues. It's a poor assumption that's being made within this treatment plan as it relates to utilizing these drugs for benefit. Now, there's a problem that comes out from the studies that we have so far on particularly the SLU-PP332, as well as other estrogen receptor agonists. It's not done on humans. A lot of the research that we have is done on rodent models and on cellular models. And what we have to remember is that rodents and cells are not humans. And because rodents and cells are not humans, we don't know if it's a direct identical response that we're going to see in humans. So just because it's working in the animals does not necessarily mean it's going to work in humans. Just because it works in humans doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work with animals. And so we have to take the preliminary findings that we're seeing with a grain of salt. Most of the responses that we see in the studies are focused on gene activation without looking at the holistic response that we see from exercise in terms of the biomechanical responses, as well as the kinematic responses, as well as the mechanical responses within the body that come about due to the activations that come from exercise. So even though we look at stuff in terms of this cellular responses that we see, in which we have these stresses that cause cellular responses cause tissue responses, and tissue responses cause body responses. Just because it's happening in the cell doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate to the whole body. And so we have to kind of look at what's taking place within the research and say, yeah, it's promising, but there's other things within the holistic approach that we have to look at. Now, the other receptors that we see, the other type of responses that we see in terms of either the PPAR responses or the AMPK responses or the GLP-1 responses that we're going to look at here in a second, is all looking at mitochondrial functions. And it goes back to that same assumption. And that same assumption is that a lot of the benefits we get from exercise is based off of energy balance due to the misapplication of caloric balance in the diet and the fact that people who have quote unquote more calories in than calories out is going to gain weight. When we start looking at exercise mimics or exercise mimics, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to give a chemical that's going to have the same metabolic responses that we get following exercise without having to do exercise. And while we do get some cellular responses, that cellular responses may not be a long-term solution to a lot of the problems that we see. When we start looking at the GLP-1 responses, the GLP-1 responses is all about glucose utilization, glucose homeostasis, that have impacts on inflammation, have impacts on the production of fats, production of lipids, what we refer to as lipogenesis, as well as adipocyte differentiation, that is, the conversion of adipose tissues between different types of adipose cells signals. When people who are over fat, people have on the fit fat continuum, are highly sedentary, have high amounts of inflammation, what ends up happening is that you have a signaling that changes fuel utilization and changes energy balance, but at the same time triggers a whole bunch of inflammatory responses that we have to correct. And the way in which we have corrected in the past is by approaching through a holistic approach. With chronic levels of inflammation, you start developing diabetic conditions. And one of the medicines that was given along with other medicines to people who have adult onset or type 2 diabetes were GLP-1 agonist medicines. And what we saw as a side effect to this, or as a secondary effect to taking these medicines, is weight loss. But it wasn't just from the medicine that caused the weight loss. There's a whole bunch of responses that we see throughout the body to GLP-1 responses. And the assumption that's being made with the GLP-1 responses is that all of the disease issues come about due to glucose regulation, which does have an impact due to glucose signaling triggering activation of certain types of cells, which triggers inflammation to take place. But the other thing, just like with the ERR agonists, is that we're looking at mitochondrial functions and trying to stimulate additional mitochondrial functions in order to increase aerobic metabolism in the body, which is going to trigger an endurance style response. And once again, we're focused on an energy balance purpose as opposed to a fitness or health purpose to exercise. And once again, it goes back to the old ideals about calorie in, calorie out, and weight balance issues due to calorie balance issues, which we know is not the best way of looking at nutrition or the best way of looking at food and at exercise, and leads to a host of issues long term as we look at how we go about balancing our nutrient loads. And it leads to a lot of side effects that we're seeing now with people who do not fit the typical person that would be taking the GLP-1 agonists, who are simply taking it in order to lose weight, who don't have the other metabolic issues, having distinct side effects that we did not necessarily see with GLP-1 agonists for people who have metabolic issues. And so one thing we have to remember is that when we're looking at this issue, when we're looking at how lifestyle and how metabolism is going to affect our overall health, it's an excessively complex problem. It's an excessively complex problem with multiple avenues of approach in terms of developing our overall health, which come about through combinations of physiological factors as well as societal factors, changes in health behaviors leading to changes in body morphology, changes in physiological factors, which all develop into our overall health. Now, the other thing we have to remember is that based off of physiological functions and the fact that we're trying to stimulate things based off of hormonal pathways, we're susceptible to having plateaus within the responses. And that's because all of the functions here are going to function off of hormonal actions, and all hormonal actions are susceptible to the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands, which means that the cells and the body is going to respond based off of the demands that we're placing upon it. Which means that if all I'm doing is taking a medicine, I'm going to respond based off taking that medicine, which means I'm going to change my receptors within the cells to, do I need that signaling pathway or do I not need that signaling pathway? Or if we don't combine the medicine with other lifestyle interventions, then we're not going to see long-term benefits. And that's one of the big things that is not necessarily being presented in a lot of the clickbait that we see within the news articles, is that we're not seeing the fact that we're not really mimicking exercise with these pills, where we are causing greater responses to exercise with these pills. It's not that the pills are doing it all by themselves, it's the fact that the pills are doing it in conjunction with the exercise. Based off of the SAID principle, what we'll see is we'll see plateauing effects within this. And we see this with both our improvements as well as with weight loss. It doesn't matter what type of improvement we're looking for. If we're looking for weight loss, or if we're looking for some sort of fitness improvement, at some point in time, we're going to start seeing plateaus take effect. And this plateaus take effect due to the SAID principle, because we're not causing a continual change. This is where periodization of exercise comes into play, periodization of diet comes into play. And one of the things that we see, particularly with the GLP-1 responses, is that we see not only plateauing taking place, but we see big rebounds taking place. And these big rebounds become greater when we start seeing responses where we have drastic weight loss. We see greater rebounds once we have stopped using the medicine. And it goes back to this idea about the plateau effect and the SAID principle, where if I'm not doing things that I should be doing in terms of lifestyle changes, I'm not going to see the long-term benefits come about from the treatment. This is where we have to remember treatment has to be holistic in terms of the approach of treatment. But at the same time, what we have to do is we have to make sure we're not making this a body image or a weight bias approach to treatment. That's one of the things that comes into play. We start looking at who's going to approach taking these drugs. It's the fact that people start thinking these drugs are a miracle drug. But the problem is that it doesn't fix any of the psychological to the treatment. It doesn't fix the fact that we have weight bias and body image bias within the population. We don't have a fix to the fact that we have these unrealistic ideals about how quickly changes can take place or why changes take place based off of social stigmatisms. We haven't looked at the fact that we have these internalized issues that come up, and the fact that, oh, we now have this pill that can somehow mimic exercise. Just go and take this pill. We already have huge body dissatisfaction issues. And we already have huge issues in terms of weight bias and body image bias amongst healthcare professionals, as well as people in general throughout the population, where we automatically assume that someone that is overfat, someone who is quote unquote obese, is that way because they're lazy, or is that way because they choose to be that way. Why don't they just exercise? Well, here's a pill you can take to exercise. So there is no reason why you should look the way that you look in terms of having excessive fatness. But the problem is that it's simply just moving the stigma along. It's projecting the stigma even further. So, do we have a pill? Is there a pill that is effective to mimic exercise that is effective to lead to weight loss. Yes, but the problem is that the medication does not act independent of any type of lifestyle modification. The medication loses effectiveness and does not offer long-lasting effects. It's going to progress and continue to have weight biases. It doesn't lead to the same type of benefits that we see from exercise. And because of this, it can lead to more harm than good, which means that we have to kind of slow down our approach to these ideals. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope you got a little bit out of the conversation. Please make sure you're giving that thumbs up, saying that you like what we're doing. Share out what we're putting out there with your friends. Make sure you've subscribed. Click that bell so you get alerts. Make sure you're following us on all of the various platforms that we're publishing on YouTube, as well as here on the podcast, Substack, as well as on Instagram and on Threads.